It was not added on the House side. It was, in fact, the Senate side. It was clearly a mistake and shouldn't have been done. Let's just go ahead and state what it is. It's just an absurd policy. You can believe that the current tax rates that are X, whether it's for the lowest bracket or the highest, should stay the same. But if you do that, you have to do math. What will be the impact then on revenue? That we ought to at least say, if we're going to do the tax policy, at least do the spending policy. Have the courage and the fortitude to do what you campaign on when you're talking about balancing the dang budget. My colleagues in the Senate failed us. Anybody want to challenge what I just said mathematically? It is rare indeed that I have too many reasons to agree in this room, but I do have to go ahead and start with the absurdity of that provision that was added by the Senate. In fairness to our chairman, it was not added on the House side. It was, in fact, the Senate side. It was clearly a mistake and shouldn't have been done. Let's just go ahead and state what it is. It's just an absurd policy. Why would you penalize a state for having a lower error rate and encourage them to have a higher error rate, which I can read the provision to do nothing else. So let's just call balls and strikes here. That was a ball, and it wasn't even close. A couple things here, just to level set for the American people. If I can just go down the line real quick, and none of this is just level setting. We're all here just reacting to what we're reacting to. Okay, there's not trying to put anybody on the hot seat or anything else. Can you just tell me whether you've been able to read the Senate bill as it came over from the Senate before testifying here today? Can we just go down the line? Yourself, have you been able to read the Senate bill?
Just within the scope of the agriculture requirement title. So the changes that were made there,
You're able to read the changes to the bill.
the summaries of them, the items that they made.
Ranking member,
No.
chairman.
I am reading through it as we speak.
You're reading the
I
bill.
have not read through the entirety of it.
So you have not read it. You're reading through the bill while we're here.
Correct.
Right.
We continue.
Ranking member.
Yeah, actually, my answer is exactly the same as Jody's.
Chairman.
We're reading the wraparound, reading the wraparound amendment that affected our area. Briefly, not word for word, to get familiar with the changes before we came here, and we'll be reading it tonight.
Ranking member.
My reaction is the same as Chairman Guthrie. We tried as quickly as possible to get through it, but we only had like an hour before we had to come here. So no, we've not been able to read the whole thing or
Chairman Smith.
Just to read summaries, particularly relating to our jurisdiction on Ways and Means.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Chairman Smith.
The tax provisions we've been following throughout the whole process. The bill that was, the language was dropped on Saturday. I'm very well aware of everything that's in that. The wraparound amendment that was a couple hours ago, I know the details of it, but I know the tax provisions.
I appreciate that. I don't intend to take a whole lot of time for all of our benefit. It's fairly well documented that I've got strong concerns and reservations about the bill. I do think a couple of questions merit observation. And so I'm going to ask, again, in a non-pointed, as a matter of fact as I possibly can way, to my friend from Texas, if it is our understanding that at least as we accept the CBO analysis, even on a dynamic basis, assuming the Budget Committee's assumption of 2.6% growth and therefore 2.5 or 6 trillion of additional revenue created from that growth, that it would still leave us about $651 billion in additional deficit spending, still accounting for the defense and border plus up. Is that roughly accurate?
That's accurate.
And to the best of our understanding, and I think you answered this question earlier, to the extent that we had a framework in place that we thought was important to adhere to, are we within that framework?
We are, the Senate's bill is about 450 plus 450, I think 5 billion outside of that.
Outside of that framework. And that that number is different because it does not factor in the defense and the border plus up. Is that correct?
The 455?
Yeah, that variance
differential?
to the 650
It's mostly
billion.
the cost of tax policy being different than what it was in the House on a current law basis, on a current law perspective.
The numbers we're talking about here in the variance with respect to the CBO calculation, that does not factor in interest. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And if we were to factor in interest, the number would be necessarily higher if those deficit numbers are correct, presupposing that they're correct, which these are all models. Is that fair?
For every dollar you borrow, 50 cents on that dollar is going to interest, so it's a significant additional cost.
Would it sound correct that if we're at $651 billion of additional deficit spending, that if you use the CBO's own calculator at the CBO's own assumed 3.5% interest rates, which are far from guaranteed over the coming several years, that would produce over $1 trillion of interest? I'm sorry, let me restate that. Over $1 trillion total when you take the 651 and then add in interest, that we would be in the $1.2 trillion range.
You are in the ballpark.
So that is the concern for those out there trying to observe what we're doing about the extent to which there's deficit implications to the legislation that was moved forward from the Senate and sent to us. I think it's important, and I might ask, might have a question here, just for level setting, because there's differences of opinion here in philosophy. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have opined that they're trying to mock trickle down and kind of impacted the implications of tax policy. We can have those differences of opinion about where we want dollars to reside. And we believe we want dollars to reside in the pockets of Americans. Whether it's the child tax credit, you can debate the policy. I've got some views on that. Whether it's this doubling of the standard deduction, whether it's the marginal rates, which are lower for people in the lower end of the strata and lower on people at the higher end of the strata, right? We can at least agree to the facts. Those are all true. And that some of those impact people hugely in numbers, people at the lower end of the spectrum. So we're talking about tax rates that are and tax policies that are helping working class and poorer Americans. We're also talking about tax rates that are, by definition, going to impact and help those at the upper end of the spectrum. You say help. Well, they don't need the dollars to live. But the question is whether those dollars are going to create more wealth and jobs in their pockets, right? There's a philosophy on the right side of the spectrum that they do that. I adhere to that philosophy, that the money in the hands of the American people produces wealth. You produce wealth, you create jobs, you create opportunity. I think that's a good thing. Where I think I've got a problem is that the Senate wanted to embrace that part in full. They wanted to go whole hog on that. And they want to go, fine, we'll make tax cuts permanent over 10 years. Great, God bless them. I'd love to do that. I'd love to have rates that don't change and they're permanent and they're low. But by doing that, they're exposing the problem. And that problem is just simple arithmetic. And that is, if you do that, then you're going to have an issue with respect to revenue and with respect to spending. And the last point that I'll address, rather than in the form of a question, is the policy baseline. The policy baseline is a dangerous gambit. It is a dangerous gambit for either side of the aisle. Because to my colleagues on this side of the aisle, please come explain to me, when my colleagues on that side of the aisle are talking about what's going to happen with the Affordable Care Act subsidies, what's going to happen in future policymaking when it comes to things we disagree with, when you just assume what is current policy rather than having us vote on said policy. I've seen a lot of messaging and rhetoric coming from very good friends of mine talking about how it's somehow anathema or accepting leftist dogma to say and to ask the question about a policy baseline about whether or not that is foregoing our responsibility to do the math. You can believe that the current tax rates that are X, whether it's for the lowest bracket or the highest, should stay the same. And I take on face value that many of my colleagues, the administration, and myself included, would like them to stay at that level or even lower. That's my preference. But if you do that, you have to do math. What will be the impact then on revenue? And my colleagues, I think, in the Senate in particular, because God bless the House, at least we've created a framework by which we were trying to do dollar for dollar. And I realize my colleagues on the other side of the aisle disagreed with that. But I want to give credit to the Budget Committee chairman for trying to hold a line of saying that there ought to at least be a connection, that we ought to at least say, if we're going to do the tax policy, at least do the spending policy. Have the courage and the fortitude to do what you campaign on when you're talking about balancing the dang budget. Don't just talk about it. Don't talk about balanced budget amendments and then go home and say, look at me. I got a balanced budget amendment vote. Did it fail? Did it? Yeah. No, it failed, yeah. Is it law? No. Right? But man, I got you your tax cuts. But ignore that inflation that is a result of $37 trillion of debt. My colleagues in the Senate failed us. My colleagues in the Senate failed us. They sent us a bill knowingly, using a policy baseline gimmick. They sent it knowingly. And they sent it knowing that it was going to have increased deficits. Last question, I'm sorry, it's for my good friend from Texas who I don't really want to put on the spot here in a way that's beyond, I think, the core question, but this matters. Regardless of what one thinks about these policies and wanting to be able to have the economic growth, I want the tax cuts to be permanent, I want all this stuff. But is it fair to say that the lion's share of the deficits will be in the first 5 years of the 10-year budget window? Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's fair.
Is that relatively irrefutably fair to say?
It's irrefutable to my knowledge.
The only way to refute the idea that in the first 4 to 5 years of the budget window that we will have significant deficits to the tune of probably close to $2 trillion, $1.8 trillion, even on a dynamic basis, assuming the Budget Committee's numbers, that you have to make up for it in the tail, in the last 5 years of the budget window. The only way to do that, to the best of my knowledge, is to assume more revenue for tariffs and assume higher growth rates. So I think you have to assume, I haven't done the exact math, 3 to 3.5% growth over 10 years, which I hope we have, and we should aspire to get, and tariff revenue at the rate that we currently are bringing it in or more, which CBO has scored, to CBO's math, 2.8 trillion? I just did that from memory. Something like that. So it'd be about $280 billion a year. So you have to assume that tariff revenue and assume, call it 3.5% roughly growth. Then you start to kind of wash out what we're doing in Congress by our choice. Everything we just said, we're leaving essentially administration to go carry out. If I'm characterizing anything incorrectly, does anybody want to challenge what I just said mathematically? With that, I will yield back.